Do you also find at times that we are way too preoccupied with our comfort and our material desires? That we prefer to distract ourselves with food, shopping, and entertainment rather than asking questions such as, what's the meaning of life? And what's my purpose here? Now, I do believe that we all, each of us, have a purpose for this life, a gift to share with the world. And when we do, we feel happy, in alignment, fulfilled. And if we don't, we feel rather empty and anxious and depressed. But what about you? Do you feel like life is just a meaningless string of events that we have to get through, ideally comfortable and maybe with a little joy? Or do you believe that there is a bigger purpose behind all of it? Well, to give us some answers and some inspirations, I have invited today Mark Gober, who is a speaker and author of an award winning book, which is called An End to Upside Down Thinking, and his newest book, An End to Upside Down Living. So thank you so much, Mark, for being here today. Welcome to Get Real with me, Dr. Friedemann. If you want to live with greater purpose, authenticity, and empowerment, this is your time to upgrade your belief systems, unlock your true potential, and discover the endless possibilities of you becoming the creator of your life.
Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, you have been already with your first book on the show, and I really enjoyed our conversation at that time. But I'm sure many viewers haven't really watched the first show, so we have to get them all up to speed to understand really what your second book was about. Now, let me ask you first, you are someone who is not necessarily or hasn't started your journey out as a seeker of truth and consciousness. I mean, you were like dabbling in astrophysics, you were a tennis player, like a really good one at college, you were an investment banker. Now, why have your whole trajectory shifted and you ended up doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, well, I never expected to be writing books and talking about the topic of consciousness. It was never on my radar. Like you said, my background's in business. But in 2016, I was listening to podcasts, not looking for anything like this, but was listening to health and business podcasts. And there was a woman on one of the shows that I was listening to who talked about psychic abilities that she had and that she worked with energy. And she talked about all these kind of metaphysical, paranormal topics that didn't really make sense to me, but she was speaking about them in a serious manner as if they were actually real to her. So I was thinking, like, is she delusional? Is she lying, or is there some reality to what she's saying? And that, the long story short, is I ended up listening to many more podcasts after hearing that one, and just out of curiosity. And then I started to look at science and realized there was actual scientific backing for many of these ideas, and it rocked my world. It still continues to rock my world, and I'm having to recalibrate everything. And my books and my podcast series called Where's My Mind, they're really outgrowths of my own personal interest. So that's the short story, is that I want to better understand reality. I came across quote unquote anomalies that didn't make sense relative to what I had learned before. So I've had to rethink reality and try to figure out what's actually going on.
Now, one of your really amazing synthesis about where physics and maybe our conventional thinking has gone off the rail is about consciousness and the brain. So, explain a little bit more, what is consciousness and why do we have it backwards, which is, I think, pretty much what upside down thinking is all about, right?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that, because this is the core issue, probably in anything I do now and anything I will do in the future, because it gets to the nature of reality and what we are as human beings. The traditional view in science, which I always thought was the case, I never even questioned this, is that we have a brain in our skull, and that brain is what creates our sense of experiencing life, the awareness that we have at this very moment and always have, which some people call consciousness. It's a very abstract thing to talk about consciousness because we can't touch it. Like, I can touch my leg, but my consciousness is here, and yet it's not a physical thing. We assume that, well, the brain must be creating that experience, because we know from neuroscience that if you let's say someone gets in a car accident, has brain damage, and then all of a sudden the person has memory loss. We can always see these correlations between what happens to the brain and the type of conscious experience someone has. But here's the really critical potential fallacy in that argument, is to say that, well, because the brain's related to consciousness, it must be the case that the brain creates it. And why can't we make that leap automatically? In statistics, there's a saying, correlation does not imply causation. So what does that mean? Imagine, and to use an analogy from a philosopher, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, who's looked at this closely too. He says, if you have a fire, firefighters show up. If you have a larger fire, you have more firefighters that show up. So there's a strong correlation between the size of the fire and the number of firefighters that appear. But do we therefore conclude that firefighters cause the fire? Not necessarily, and probably not. So there might be another explanation. And that's what my work has really sought to look at, to say, wait, there's this connection between the brain and consciousness. Science doesn't understand how this could even happen, if it does. And in fact, Science Magazine, a very credible outlet, has called this the number 2 question that remains in all of science. How could something that's not physical, like consciousness, I can't touch it, how could that emerge from something physical, like a brain and a body? And what I would argue is the brain doesn't produce consciousness. And that's why we haven't figured out this question. Rather, the brain is more like an antenna receiver, or it's like a cell phone tapping into the cloud, or more precisely, the brain is like a blindfold. And there's a much broader reality. And when the brain is actually limiting what we perceive. So to go back to Dr. Bernardo Kastrup, his analogy is, it's like we're whirlpools within an infinite stream of consciousness. So the water represents consciousness in this analogy, where we're an individual whirlpool, but we're interconnected with everything else. We have the sense of being separate, but we're not actually separate. And we're only experiencing a sliver of the stream while we're in the whirlpool.
Now, I just absolutely love that analogy. I think it's just genius. But let me just be for a moment the devil's advocate and would argue, what is consciousness and how do we even know that it exists, period? Has anyone ever seen it, measure it, or what is it?
Well, that's the challenge, is that it's an abstract concept. We all have consciousness by virtue of the fact that we are aware at this very instant. Actually, it's the only thing that we can prove in all of reality, is that I, at this moment, am conscious, that I am having the sense of being aware. I can't even prove that I was conscious in the past, because if I think about the past, it's a thought that occurs right now in the present moment. So at all times, everything that I'm experiencing is this present moment. So if we want to be as skeptical as possible, all we know is consciousness. And that's the reversal. That's the upside down thinking that I'm referring to. The upside down thinking is the belief that there's this material world, and then that we and our consciousness came about later. The world exists first, and then consciousness comes afterwards. What I'm arguing, and many others have argued this too, is that consciousness is the primary thing, and that everything we experience by definition is within the realm of consciousness itself. Even though we can't measure it with a ruler or with some kind of device, it is without consciousness, we wouldn't even be able to think about the prospect of measuring consciousness.
Right. Now, I do believe what you're writing because it really resonates very much, but let's say we are sitting in these whirlpools and basically are connected to that greater stream. You call it the one mind view. Why does the brain stop us from actually connecting to that greater consciousness? Wouldn't it be wonderful to have that?
That's the big question. Why? And I'll give some speculation, some inferences, because I don't think anyone knows for sure. If we think about our life as being part of an evolutionary process for consciousness, so if we are part of one infinite stream, one mind, which Dr. Kastrup says is having dissociative identity disorder, one mind in lots of different whirlpools. So it's this one consciousness having a diversity of experiences and forgetting its own identity. And that's sort of the idea, that it seems to be the case, that we feel like we're a body. I feel like I'm Mark, but actually my real identity is the one mind, and I'm being blocked out from this broader consciousness while in the body. What function does that serve? Well, if I remembered everything about my full nature, maybe I wouldn't be able to have the same learning experience in this body. So it might be a function of being able to learn and evolve and grow by actually limiting what we perceive. Some would say it's sort of like going to school and we're taking a test to see how we do. And if we had all the answers, we wouldn't have the same learning experience.
Now, your whole philosophy is also about, well, this is not just one go around, this is an infinite stream of basically our consciousness, having more and more experiences, meaning past lives, future lives, and so on. So is it possible that our brain also prevents us from just saying, well, I didn't like that one, so I'm just going to skip it and off myself so that I can go to the next one? I mean, is there also maybe a function of sitting it through and seeing it through to get the maximum out of it rather than skipping and making it comfortable?
I agree with that perspective. I think the challenges we experience are part of the learning process. If everything were just bliss all the time, we wouldn't necessarily be able to learn. It's through challenge and through darkness sometimes that we emerge in light. But also this topic of reincarnation, which you mentioned, I think there's real evidence for that. Conceptually speaking, if we go back to the whirlpool analogy, it's almost like the water's being recycled. So some of the water from one whirlpool emerges in another whirlpool. And as a result, sometimes the memories actually do transfer, even though many of us don't claim to have memories of a previous life. There are many cases of young children, and this has been studied at the University of Virginia for decades, over 2,500 cases of children who have a memory of a previous life, where in some cases the researchers are able to find the person that the child is referring to through historical records. And sometimes the child has physical birthmarks or defects that align with how the person died in the previous life. And in some of the cases, they can find medical records that prove that there's there's actually a person that aligns with what the child said. So I think it's a very strong line of evidence which suggesting that there is a continuation of consciousness from one to the next. And there's a transference sometimes of personality traits, of fears, desires, and even bodily traits. So there's some continuity that goes on, and my best guess, even if this isn't even fully the answer, I think it's maybe part of the answer, is that it allows us to learn. And if we knew everything, we wouldn't have the same learning experience.
Well, of course, then it begs the question. So, two questions. So, let's say whirlpool this lifetime, and you at the end go back into the stream. How does a stream sort you back out in another whirlpool? I mean, this is just, I mean, I know in your book you said, well, our mind is probably too small to really understand it all, which I completely agree with. But it is mind blowing to imagine how we are, when we're back in the stream, somehow still sorting something out to have a memory of what we were before and maybe even a continuation of the future. And so how do you see that? Do you have any answers to that, or are you as baffled as I am?
Well, I would say generally speaking, I'm baffled. I look for answers or hints to try to generalize theories. And like you alluded to, I subscribe to the idea that our brain is so limited that the answers are going to be beyond what we are capable of even comprehending. So the concept of infinity, for example, we know in math, infinity is a real thing. Our brain can't grasp what infinity is. So I think it's something similar. However, there are pieces of evidence which suggest there might be a structure to the reincarnation process, that there's intelligence behind it. One of the concepts that I've seen a number of times is known as pre-birth planning. The idea that our consciousness continues beyond this individual whirlpool, is still in a state of awareness and intelligence, and is involved in the process of quote unquote choosing the next life. And this has come about through, sometimes people have spontaneous memories of this. And in my podcast, Where's My Mind, I'm reminded of one person who talked about her own memories before coming into her body. She remembers it and was saying, this is going to be a tough life. I don't know if I want to go. And she was with beings, she claimed, that were encouraging her to come into her body, but also through hypnosis. Sometimes people spontaneously talk about this process of choosing a body and choosing parents. I'm reminded also of a case that I heard on a podcast called Buddha at the Gas Pump. This was an adult man talking about similar memories that emerged for him, not during hypnosis, where he remembers the process of seeing. He described it sort of like an iPhone screen, where if you double click it, you can see the different screens that you could click on, basically. And he said those were the lives that he he could have
Hmm.
chosen from. And he saw the different possibilities and the challenges he would face with his current family, for example. So there are these cases where people have memories, whether they're induced through hypnosis or they're spontaneous memories. And I find that interesting, that there might be an element of choosing, but there also might be an element of coercion. Like in that one woman I mentioned, she was encouraged to come into the body like she was going to have to do it even though she was hesitant. But what does all that mean? I don't know what it means. Maybe there is an intelligence behind the way in which we evolve, that we are both choosing ourselves, but there's also an intelligence behind everything, which is encouraging us to have certain lessons. And the reincarnation process is the continuation, the cycles, where we go into a body, we have an amnesia, we forget, we learn. At the end of the life, this is again an inference, there seems to be the potential for a life review. And we see this in the near-death experience. Near-death experience might be where someone's in cardiac arrest, for example. Their heart shuts off. There's no blood flowing to the brain after a certain amount of time. And yet, some people, when they're resuscitated, come back with memories, some of which are verified as accurate, meaning the person says, hey, I was hovering over my body. I saw these things in the room. I saw something in the other room. And the surgeon and the family members say, wait, that's not possible. Your brain was off. So these examples, which they're called veridical out-of-body experiences, they suggest that it's not a hallucination sometimes, because what they come back describing is accurate, and therefore it can't be a hallucination. So all that's a long way of saying what's happening in this near-death experience might be telling us something about the nature of reality rather than a hallucination. And one such event is the life review, where a person's either brain's knocked out of the situation, they're able to see part of the broader stream, so to speak, and they talk about reliving their whole life in a flash. And they relive events through the eyes of the people that they impacted. So one man that I interviewed is named Daniel Brinkley. He's had 4 of these near-death experiences. He was struck by lightning once, he had open heart surgery twice, and had brain surgery once. Each time he had this life review, where he went back to his combat days in Vietnam. He relived the deaths of the people that he killed and relived it through their eyes. So he felt the pain of that person. And he also felt the pain of the child that would no longer have a father because he had killed the father in combat. So when people come back from the near-death experience, like this man, Daniel Brinkley, their lives are typically forever changed. They say, wait a second, I was acting poorly towards people, and I'm going to experience that myself because we're all interconnected. Therefore, I'm going to reprioritize my whole life to try to treat people well, because that's what seems to matter in the life review. I got to see how my positive and loving interactions had a positive impact on people, and conversely, I saw the negative impact. So what does all this tell us in the context of your question? There might be this evolutionary process whereby we forget, and we see how we do in the test. We see how we're able to treat people.
Right.
And it's through the forgetting process that this is enabled.
Now, in your other book, The End of Upside Down Living, you also talk about how we can implement this all into, a process of, let's say, living exactly like you're describing, maybe with a greater consciousness or a greater purpose, but also, a process of starting to awaken. Now, what does awakening in all of this context mean?
To me, it is the recognition of the idea that we're more than a body, that we are a broader consciousness that extends beyond what our brain's able to comprehend, that extends beyond what our brain can remember. And what does that mean for our life? Then how do we embody it? And this is a process that has been going on throughout history. I would argue that every single person actually is on the awakening journey, because even for someone like me, who was a staunch so-called materialist, meaning I thought everything was just material, there's no meaning to life. When this body dies, there's no consciousness, that's the end. To realizing there's something more than that. So a lot of the challenges I had in my life previous to this so-called awakening could have been the enabling factor that allowed me to be open enough to explore this. So I would say that everyone's on the awakening path at different points. But once we achieve this recognition that there is more, there can be a process towards embodying it. And that's what part of my second book, An End Upside Down Living, explores. What are the challenges associated with that? Because there are many. If there is a shedding of the old sense of being, the idea that I am only Mark, that I'm only a body, there's nothing beyond this body, to wait, there's more. How do I incorporate that? What do I need to shed from my ego? And that's an up and down process. which I think ultimately leads people to be in a more evolved state and often a happier state, but it can be a rocky journey to get there.
Well, back to the whirlpool. Let's see, we are in the whirlpool and we are in this illusion of separation. And all of a sudden we have this moment of awakening and we are realizing, oh wow, there is actually a connection. And you in your first book, write about beautiful evidence about that connection where consciousness can actually be transferred from one whirlpool to the next, and so psychokinesis and there were other things that you were describing there, astral viewing and so on. But what I'm curious about is just like, and that's something I really loved about in your book that you wrote. Once you have your awakening, it's not done. It's not like, oh, now I know there is a one mind, there is a flow, there is now I'm enlightened. Actually, then the process gets really hard where you have to do the cleanup and the growing. And just talk a little bit more about that.
Yes. One of the misconceptions in the awakening field, people who study this, is that there is a final state to achieve. And some will call it enlightenment. And once you achieve that, it's over. But the more I research this, the more I think it's a never-ending, infinite process, that there is a constant growth, constant evolution. No matter how evolved one seems to be, there's no end to it. In the same way that there might be no end to consciousness, that it might be literally an infinite stream. But there's also another misconception that I've come across, which is that in the awakening process, the primary and potentially sole purpose is to reach enlightenment and be fully awakened, to know that we are the one mind, or whatever we want to call it, and to fully embody it and to experience it. And for some people, it's often a blissful state of unconditional love, and to get there, and that's it. It's known as waking up. But there are also what Ken Wilber, who's the philosopher, he calls lines of development in the process that are sometimes relatively independent. So he says it's waking up, cleaning up, and growing up. Waking up is just part of the process. So cleaning up refers to the idea that many of us have trauma, whether it's trauma from this life that we haven't fully processed. It might be ancestral trauma that we are still processing through a phenomenon known as epigenetics, where trauma from an ancestor can actually be transferred. Some speak of that as a possibility. And also potential past life trauma from our individual consciousness. And maybe there's even collective trauma that we deal with, because if we're all interconnected, there might be more to it. There needs to be a process to process that trauma, to clear it, and to actually focus on it rather than ignore it. And to ignore that trauma or whatever darkness we have within us is known as spiritual bypass, which is a tempting thing to do, to say, I just want to go for the bliss. I want to just meditate all day, or do a psychedelic experience, or have a near-death experience where it's all unconditional love. I want to ignore the darkness. It's a very important part of the spiritual process for people to actually evolve more when they don't do the bypass, when they go into whatever is still dark within them. So that's cleaning up. Then the third area is growing up. And that's really a reference to maturation. I think there are many ways to look at it. One of which is, I think, to acknowledge reality as it is, and not to constantly wear rose-colored glasses, to acknowledge that there is darkness, and also, I think, to take responsibility, not to be a victim all the time, to take real responsibility in our lives for ourselves and for others. So waking up, cleaning up, growing up is a simple way to remember it, that it's not just one of those. And there are probably more lines of development as well, but just being aware of the expansion beyond waking up is important.
Yeah. And I have to say, I'm really grateful for the fact that I can do work with clients on a subconscious level on cleaning up and growing up, because in some ways you could say, well, if the brain is a filter, maybe the subconscious is the intercessor between this one mind and the more conscious mind. Because when we do go into meditation, when we are suspending the conscious mind, usually it's a subconscious that can tune into these, whatever you call it, frequencies, energies, consciousness streams, and then if the subconscious mind is blocked with trauma and suppressed pain and these kind of things, of course, it does not have the same awareness or openness to connect to the one mind. But do you believe the one mind? I mean, a lot of people would say, like, well, what's the difference between the one mind and God? what would you say? I mean, someone who's really religious says, well, you're talking about, the Bible tells us all these stories just in a different way. So where do you find there is an overlap, or where do you feel like that may be different?
Well, to me, it always depends on one's definition of God, and that's often a term that's not well defined. So for me, the one mind could be analogized to God, but it's not in a personal sense. So some people would say that God is this external being, a transcendent force, as a separate entity. And some would even anthropomorphize it, where God has almost personal characteristics and there's an interaction of a me and a God that's separate. So to me, there is a transcendent aspect to God. But if we go back to the whirlpool analogy, we're whirlpools within the stream, meaning if the water is consciousness, so to speak, we all have consciousness within us. We all have God within us, but God is also beyond the whirlpool. And some religious traditions even say this, that God is both immanent within and transcendent beyond. It's both. And if that's the definition of God, this interconnected field of intelligence, unconditional love, consciousness, awareness, if that's what people mean by God, then that's how I see it as well. It's interesting looking at religions, however, many of the mystical traditions, the mystical cores of all the religions that I've come across, they tend to talk about this idea of a unified field of consciousness, a unified something that we're a part of. And there might be different branches of rituals and customs and beliefs that come off of that, but the core, at least for the mystical sects of many religions, gets to the same idea that I'm speaking of, which to me is actually strong evidence that not only is there science backing this, but people throughout time have arrived at similar conclusions, often because they've had experiences through meditation or psychedelics or other things where they experienced it and they say, whoa, this is how it is. Then they come back in their body and they talk about what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, when I help people with hypnosis to go way back, there are certainly these experiences that are going into the time before this lifetime that feels like a one mind experience, a deep connection to that. I don't know what you want to call it, field of infinite possibilities, sea of unconditional love, whatever it is, but it's often, especially for people who have no preconceived notion or even belief system, just a kind of a transformational experience to go there. And it often just goes there naturally. So it's definitely something that I find is inside of us, this awareness. We just have to unlock it. And talking about unlocking, you also say that the one mind is nudging us, just like it nudged you to actually do the awakening. So that would actually mean that there is some, benevolent intention or force in that one mind that says, "Hey, you're asleep. Let's wake you up." And how does the waking up happen? I mean, how does it nudge us?
Well, if we think about the nature of consciousness, the nature of God, the nature of the one mind, I look to these spiritually transformative experiences. They can be spontaneous, they can be in hypnosis, they could be meditation, near-death experience, psychedelics, many different cases. There is a similarity in what people describe, that there is an unconditionally loving force that they're a part of, that is difficult to describe with words. And to me, that's powerful because many different experiences independently are saying the same thing. So I think the nature of reality, the nature of God, consciousness, one mind, is inherently benevolent. And part of our evolutionary process, the awakening process, is to embody that benevolent state, that state of unconditional love while we're here, and actually to fully remember it. And when we're off course, we can have challenges that seem like challenges at the time. They might seem horrible, but they're nudging us in this other direction towards something that's ultimately benevolent. And how that manifests for each person might be very different. For some people, it could be death or sickness. For other people, it could be failure. So I think the nudging happens in different ways. And what I found since I had this experience several years ago where I rethought reality, I've become more attuned to where I might be nudged. I look at my life as sort of a teacher. And actually Nisargadatta Maharaj, a famous sage in the Vedic tradition, he said that life is the supreme guru.
Mm.
That we could look at our life, everything that's happening to us as a form of intelligence. And if we're hitting resistance in a certain area, whereas before I might have just gone full force ahead, now I look and say, wait a second, am I doing something wrong? I evaluate things differently, because I find in my own life and in many awakening stories that when we're on the right track, things seem to move smoothly. And if there's resistance, it's a reason for us to examine things. Is it something that we need to clear within ourselves? Are we on the wrong path? And ultimately, everything is leading us back to the state of unconditional love. So that's always good compass as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just right before our conversation talked to a client of mine who was completely a few weeks ago in a state of deep anxiety, depression, overwhelm because she had a job that she absolutely she told me later it felt like my essence was squeezed to the size of a little pea. And so she stepped out of it and said, you know, I'm going to take the leap of faith. And somehow she happened to run into a voice coach who has been coaching really like famous singers. And somehow she got a session. So she went there and the voice coach made, you know, an hour session, almost 2 hour session, because he said, my God, you have not just talent, you are gifted, you are amazing. And then she really felt like, wow, I actually saw for the first time how I'm an infinite being, how I actually have so much to share. And it really shifted her completely. So this feeling of anxiety and, you know, really feeling squeezed to annihilation was the nudge. I believe that really showed her, well, there is another path and there is another gift for you to experience and share. So it was really just serendipitous that we have been, you know, just talking. I just talked with her right before our conversation. Now, unfortunately, we are almost done, but I want to ask you about, you know, at the beginning, I talk about purpose. So what do you feel like, knowing everything now that you have explored? What is your purpose here in the world?
Well, ultimately, I think we're all here to wake up and clean up and grow up, to evolve ourselves. So that's how I look at my own life. I want to perfect myself as much as possible, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, to be the best version of myself, the most authentic version of myself. And I think when we do that, whatever that means for us individually, it allows us to be the purest vessel possible for this infinite consciousness and intelligence. And when we are the purest vessel possible, we're able to be of service in some way, because we're all interconnected. But to me, it always starts with the perfecting of the individual so that one can serve the collective. But it starts with the individual. That's a really important piece of it, because there can be a temptation just to go externally and then leave our own stuff behind, and because it's uncomfortable to do that and maybe more challenging. But there's a dual aspect to it, that we work on ourselves and then we are of service as a result. At least that's how I see it.
And what would you tell the listeners and viewers as this is maybe the first step to be on this path? What, you know, you have like a list of 10 different suggestions, which I loved in your book. But what would you suggest if you are just want to explore more the one mind view, or just start the waking up process? What would you suggest?
Well, the yogic pathways to me are a good framework that could encompass any spiritual tradition. So I'll very quickly go through these, because I think the spiritual process involves all of these areas, no matter what you do. The first is the pathway of knowledge and wisdom. So that could be listening to podcasts. Maybe you say one podcast a week I'm going to listen to try to understand the nature of reality, something that simple. Or it could be much more. For me, it was like all I did when I first became interested, but just having an intention to learn more about the nature of reality and who and what we are. The pathway of selfless service, thinking about how you can be of service, will inherently get us there. The devotional pathway, which can be of a form of chanting, praying, rituals, or it could be an overall attitude of, some would say, love for the divine, the acknowledgement and gratitude that we're part of this one mind. So that's devotion. And the fourth is generally energy. So that could be meditation. It could be physical, anything like working out, nutrition, breathing exercises. For me, meditation's been a big part of that, but anything that is working on the energetic, physical aspects. So knowledge and wisdom, selfless service, devotion, and energy. Thinking about those pathways of how in one's life are you in those four areas. Usually people on their awakening path start in one area and then the other areas naturally become incorporated because they're all related. For me, because this is such a focus, I'm always thinking about all four. What am I doing in each area?
Well, and of course, a really first step could be also to read your books. So, how do they find you and how can they also listen to your podcast?
Well, I wrote my books and did my podcast really for that purpose, because for me, I had to look at many different resources that seemed really separate and some weren't credible. So I wanted to put the most credible stuff together so that people could have a starting point. And my books, An End to Upside Down Thinking and An End to Upside Down Living, are on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the major bookstores, and they're on Kindle, Audible, and also hardcover. And my podcast, called Where Is My Mind, is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the major podcast players.
Excellent. And you have a website too.
My website is my name, MarkGober.com.
Well, thank you, Mark, so much for another fascinating conversation. I'm sure you're going to be on again soon because I just think there is so much to delve into. But that already gave us a lot of inspiration. And thank you for tuning in today. I want to leave you with a quote by David Hawkins, which is, "Our contribution to the world is the perfection of our own self." With that, take good care. Hi, Dr. Friedemann here. Thank you for tuning into my YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about fear and anxiety, here you'll find guided meditations, webinars, and interviews with some of the most renowned experts in the field of empowerment. Delve into the over 230 videos and more to come every week.